In the far reaches of space, where stars faded into cold silence and light rarely touched anything, a giant shape drifted near a dead sun. It was a massive ship, dark and quiet, its metal surface scarred by battles long forgotten. This place had no name, no signals, and no traffic. Even traders and pirates stayed away. For many years, the ship floated there like a forgotten tomb, lifeless and cold. Most believed it was an ancient war relic from a race that had vanished long ago. Some even thought it was cursed. But the truth was far more dangerous because it wasn't dead. It was waiting. The Zarnathi scavenger crew aboard the drifting Gale didn't care about old ghost stories. They were professionals who made a living by stripping old wrecks and selling rare tech to the highest bidder. When their scanners picked up the huge metallic structure in this dead system, they saw it as a golden opportunity. The ship didn't match any design in the Dominion's database. It had no markings, no registry, and no distress signals. That only made it more valuable. Captain Valar, an old Zarnathi with silver horns and sharp eyes, gave the order to board. He had seen many derelict ships, and none of them had ever caused him trouble. But this one felt different, though he couldn't explain why. It was a feeling in his chest, like pressure before a storm. The boarding team entered through a side bay that had already been damaged. Inside, they found darkness, dust, and silence. Their lights revealed massive halls, strange doorways, and walls made of a metal no one could identify. Some parts of the ship looked like they had grown naturally, as if the metal had shifted and healed itself over time. It was both beautiful and eerie. The deeper they went, the more unusual things they found: strange machines that hummed without power, tubes of liquid that still bubbled, and rooms full of broken weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum of nightmares. One of the engineers, a young Zarnathi named Kevin, whispered, "This wasn't made by any species I know. It's different. Aggressive." His voice echoed through the empty corridors, unanswered. In the control center, they found something that made everyone pause. A huge command chair sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by curved screens and a console that looked like it had been fused into the floor. Behind it was a long, sealed pod glass, reinforced and glowing faintly with a blue mist inside. Something or someone was inside. It was humanoid, tall and armored, but they couldn't see its face. Kevin approached the console and tried to access the ship's memory banks, but the system was locked behind ancient codes. The ship suddenly powered on for a second, lights flickered, and a voice echoed through the control room in a deep, alien language. The translator took a few seconds, then the voice repeated in broken common tongue, "Biocore containment failing. Combat protocol activation imminent." The crew exchanged nervous glances. Captain Valar stepped forward and spoke calmly. "It's just an old warning system. There's no power. We're safe." But no one truly believed that. They tried to ignore the voice and continued scanning. The scientist on board, Dr. Azari, found data fragments hidden deep in the memory banks. What little she could read spoke of a race called humans. Most of the galaxy had forgotten them. Some believed they were only a myth told by soldiers to scare young recruits. Stories about creatures who fought like monsters, survived anything, and built ships that could outthink and outfight anything. Dr. Asari frowned. "If this is human tech, we should leave." "Right now," she said softly. But Valar laughed and shook his head. "We're already inside. We've come too far to walk away." What none of them realized was that the ship had recognized them the moment they boarded. Sensors had activated silently, scanning every one of them. It measured heartbeats, movement, speech. It had no loyalty to the Zarnathi, and it remembered the wars. It remembered betrayal. It remembered fear. Deep inside the core, the sleeping pilot stirred. His mind, half connected to the ship, even in stasis, began to wake. Memories returned like falling stars: explosions, orders, screams, silence. His name, he could barely recall it, but he remembered one thing clearly: this ship wasn't built to drift in peace. It was built to fight. As the scavengers moved deeper into the ship, doors began to close quietly behind them. Systems long dormant began humming to life. Defensive turrets hidden in walls scanned for targets but didn't fire. The ship was waiting for orders, waiting for the captain to wake. Kevin tried to return to the entry bay, only to find it sealed. "Captain," he said through the comms, "the way out is locked." Villar didn't respond. He was staring at the sealed pod, the one with the figure inside. The glass was now glowing brighter. The mist inside began to swirl. For the first time in 1,000 years, the ship's AI activated the awakening protocol. Without warning, alarms blared through the ship. Not the kind made by Zarnathi tech, but deep, booming sounds like thunder inside metal. Lights turned red. The voice returned, clearer this time, Biocore online. Systems engaged. Defense grid warming. Kevin screamed over the comms, "Captain!" Something's coming alive. This isn't a wreck, it's a trap. But it wasn't a trap. It was a response. The ship didn't attack. It was waiting for its captain to open his eyes. And he did. The man inside the pod twitched, then his eyes opened, glowing faintly in the dark. The pod hissed and unlocked, releasing cold steam into the room. He stepped out slowly, looking around at the strange faces, the alien uniforms, the ship's control center, now lit with red warning lights. His body moved like a soldier's, steady, trained, dangerous. The scavengers froze. They didn't know who or what he was, but they could feel the pressure in the airshift. This wasn't an ordinary person. This was a weapon that had been asleep for far too long. And now it was awake. Captain Villar raised his hands, trying to speak, but the man didn't respond. He walked past them like they didn't matter. The ship responded to him, lighting the path ahead, unlocking doors, shifting controls. This was his ship, and it had waited centuries just to hear his voice again. He reached the command chair and sat. The ship greeted him. "Welcome back, Captain Calder." Hostile presence detected. "Shall we proceed?" And Calder, barely awake, simply nodded. Outside the ship, space remained silent. But in the dark corners of the galaxy, something ancient had stirred. Something the stars had not seen in 1,000 years. Humanity's last dreadnought was no longer silent. It was alive. Asa, the human captain, sat in the command chair. His presence seemed to awaken more than just the lights and systems. He was a living key, and the entire ship responded like a loyal beast finally hearing its master's voice again after centuries of silence. The walls pulsed faintly with energy. Hidden engines deep inside the hull began to hum, and displays all across the control center lit up with star maps, warning codes, and lists of long-dead enemy fleets. The Zarnathi scavengers stood frozen, their courage crumbling fast as they watched something far older and more dangerous than they had imagined begin to take control again. Captain Villar whispered into his comm, telling his crew to regroup and fall back, but the doors had already sealed them in. They weren't just trapped, they were being observed. The human, now fully awake, scanned the displays with sharp eyes, not saying a word yet. His face was unreadable, but behind his eyes was something: heavy memories of war, of betrayal, of missions long completed, and comrades never coming home. He could tell from the way the system spoke to him that something had changed in the galaxy. The ship was trying to catch up on history, but there was a gap too large to fill in just seconds. As data streamed through, one word kept flashing across every screen in sharp red letters: extinct. The ship had believed all humans were gone. That had been the last order it received: to hide, sleep, and wait for a signal that never came. Calder exhaled slowly, like someone waking up to a nightmare that had never ended, and as the silence inside the ship thickened, the scavengers realized they weren't dealing with a ghost. They had stepped onto a battlefield where the war had only paused, not ended. Dr. Asari finally broke the tension with a question that shook in her voice. "Who are you?" Calder looked at her without blinking and replied simply, "The last mistake your galaxy made." The ship began scanning the surrounding stars, searching for familiar signals, old enemy codes, or beacons from Earth, but found none. What it did find instead was something that made even Calder narrow his eyes: silence. Too much silence. Entire sectors with no active transmissions. Planets where once thousands of signals buzzed now lay dark. The AI spoke again, softer this time, almost like it was hesitating. Enemy empires detected fragmented. Star Union dissolve. Zarnathi declared dominant. Hostile classification confirmed. Calder raised an eyebrow, turning slightly toward Valar. "You run the galaxy now?" he asked. Valar, who had once stood tall with pride in his voice, now looked away, saying nothing. Kevin, standing near one of the sealed exits, whispered, "He's gonna kill us." But Calder didn't move toward them. Instead, he gave a command, and the ship's view screens changed to show ancient war footage, human dreadnoughts in combat, moving like titans through space, obliterating fleets with weapons the Zarnathi couldn't even understand. He showed them what fear looked like. "This ship wasn't built to scare you," Calder said. "It was built to stop something worse. If you're in charge now, where are the threats?" The Zarnathi had no answer. They didn't know what to say to a warrior who had fought enemies they had only read about in historical fragments, and who now sat in a ship powerful enough to destroy entire star systems. Dr. Isari stepped forward carefully and offered a datapad, saying, "There was a great silence nearly 600 years ago. Empires collapsed. Entire sectors vanished. No one knows why. Some say something came and wiped everything." Calder didn't take the pad, but he listened closely. This, he realized, wasn't peace. It was the calm after a storm no one had survived. "You've been living on the ashes of better civilizations," he muttered, and stood up. Alarms rang again, this time softer, almost like warnings. The ship had detected something, faint signals, approaching fast. Not Zarnathi. Not anything in their current database. The AI hesitated before speaking. "Unknown ships inbound. No known registry. Cloaked signatures detected. Likely threat." Calder looked at the scavengers, then turned to his command console. "You led them here," he said coldly, but he wasn't angry. He was preparing. The scavengers tried to explain they had no idea anyone had followed them, but it didn't matter now. Whatever was coming had waited until the ship activated. It wanted the dreadnought alive, or destroyed. Calder activated the ship's weapon systems, and energy surged through the hull like a sleeping beast, stretching its limbs. The turrets moved. The shields powered up. Deep within the core, systems hidden for centuries blinked back to life. A new war was beginning, and the scavengers were stuck in the middle of it. Outside the ship, space began to shimmer. Shadows formed where there had been none. Ships appeared black, silent, shaped like knives cutting through the stars. No signals, no warnings, no introductions. Just silent movement, like predators circling prey. Calder watched them with eyes that had seen monsters before. "You thought the war was over," he said, "but you were wrong." It just went quiet, and with a single command, the dreadnought shifted from a dead relic to a war machine ready to fight once more. The past had returned, and the galaxy wasn't ready. The air inside the dreadnought felt different now, not just because the systems were alive, but because something deeper had awakened, something no one fully understood yet. Captain Calder stood calmly as the lights pulsed with a slow rhythm, matching the heartbeat of a warship that was no longer asleep. Every system, from the engine core to the outermost weapon turret, responded like a living creature stretching after a deep slumber. The ship was thinking again. It was remembering. Its memory banks, which had once been sealed, were now unlocking file after file, and as Calder scrolled through them, he saw battle plans, war reports, classified missions, and names of enemies long erased from history. But what unsettled him most wasn't what the files revealed, it was what they didn't. There were pieces missing, entire sections blacked out, as if the ship had tried to forget parts of its own past. And outside, the unknown ships still hovered, cloaked and quiet, waiting like hunters in the dark. The Zarnathi scavengers, still trapped within the control chamber, had gone silent as well, watching Calder like frightened witnesses in a place they never should have entered. Dr. Isari tried to speak, but her words failed as she realized that the ship was scanning her, examining her DNA, comparing her to older records. The ship whispered its findings to Calder. Species Zarnathi known. Not a threat. Not a friend. Possible opportunists. Calder didn't comment. His mind was focused on something else. The ship had begun to broadcast a signal into deep space, a distress call not for help, but for attention. It was a signal written in ancient human code, and it asked a question only a few could answer. Is anyone left? It wasn't just a call. It was bait. Calder wanted to know what would respond, friends, foes, or something worse. And far away, something did respond. A faint echo came back, weak but real, and the coordinates it carried pointed to an area long believed to be a dead zone, no stars, no colonies, no history. Calder marked it and said nothing to the others. He needed to know what the galaxy had turned into while humanity was silent. But the ship knew more than he did. It had detected fragments of human tech in that same zone before going dormant centuries ago. That was why it had hidden there, not just to rest, but to guard something. Calder walked to the center of the control deck, placed his hand on the command panel, and gave an order he hadn't spoken in decades: prepare for launch. The ship rumbled softly, its engines powering up for the first time in hundreds of years. The scavengers panicked, realizing they were about to be dragged into a war they didn't understand. Valar demanded to be released, but Calder only stared at him with cold eyes. "You woke me," he said. "Now you see what that means." The ship lifted slightly from the ancient docking platform, its grav engines engaging as the massive hull turned toward the stars. Outside, the enemy ships moved closer, still silent, still hiding behind strange cloaking fields that flickered like shadows. Calder narrowed his eyes. He didn't trust them. They were watching, calculating, and the dreadnought didn't like being watched. Without waiting for a warning, the ship fired a pulse wave, non-lethal, but powerful enough to shake any hidden vessel out of stealth. And it worked. One by one, the ships were revealed. They weren't Zarnathi. They weren't any species on record. Their design was sleek, black, and quiet, with no visible weapons, but Calder knew better. These weren't scouts. These were collectors. Their job wasn't to fight, it was to gather. And what they wanted now was the dreadnought. Calder didn't wait for negotiations. He activated the defense grid, and the dreadnought's main cannons turned with terrifying speed. The first volley wasn't a warning, it was a statement. Beams of energy tore through space, hitting two of the strange ships and cutting them in half. The others scattered, surprised by the speed and power of a ship they thought was dead. Valar stared in shock as the sky outside lit up with silent explosions. "You didn't just find a ship," Calder said without turning around. "You found the last guardian of something this galaxy has forgotten." The ship shook as return fire slammed into its shields, but the dreadnought barely flinched. Its armor was layered with old human alloys no modern empire could reproduce. It had been built for survival, and now it had something to protect again. Calder knew they couldn't stay and fight, not yet. He needed answers. He needed to follow that signal. He set a course for the dead zone, ignoring the scavengers' protests. "You want to live?" he asked. "Then stay quiet and stay out of my way." The ship jumped to light speed, leaving behind a battlefield and a message to the galaxy. Humanity was no longer silent. The awakening had begun, and with it, the galaxy's darkest fears were about to return. The stars were not peaceful that night, not silent as they once seemed. They whispered strange things, carried fear in their cold light, and reminded the crew of the human dreadnought that the galaxy was no longer safe. Captain Calder stared out from the command deck, watching the strange shapes drifting just beyond the edge of sensor range, their outlines flickering like shadows that didn't belong. After the jump into the dead zone, the dreadnought had been silent for a moment too long, as if it too was unsure whether it had made a mistake. There was no sun in this part of space, no warmth, just a hollow darkness where signals were swallowed and lights died quickly. And yet, something was there, something moving. The scanners picked up fragments of wreckage, but not like any wreck Calder had seen before. Ships from different eras and species floated together, torn apart as if by claws instead of weapons. Dr. Isari tried to analyze the data, but even the ship's advanced systems couldn't identify the energy signatures that clung to the ruins. There were signs of something unnatural, something that had erased entire crews without leaving bodies behind. The scavengers who had once shouted and threatened now sat silently in the corners of the deck, their confidence broken, their eyes wide with dread. Valar whispered in his own language, old words that spoke of cursed systems and ancient fears, warning of zones where the stars lied and ships disappeared forever. Calder knew fear when he saw it, and this wasn't fear of war. This was fear of something older, something whispered across generations. The dreadnought itself seemed uneasy, its lights dimming slightly, as if it too felt the weight of invisible eyes watching. And then, without warning, a signal broke through the silence. It wasn't a distress call, it was a scream. Not in words, but in raw data, a burst of sound and code so loud and broken that the ship's systems recoiled from it. The scream came from nearby, and Calder gave the order to move in, though every instinct told him to turn back. As they approached the source, they saw it, a human ship, or what was left of it, drifting slowly with its hull twisted in impossible angles. The dreadnought connected to the ship's logs, but most of it was corrupted except for one file, which played automatically. A terrified voice, shaking and almost broken, said, "We found something in the dark. We tried to talk to it. We shouldn't have." Then silence. Calder turned to the crew, but before he could speak, the ship shuddered. Something had touched the dreadnought. Not a missile, not a weapon, but something soft, like fingers sliding across its hull. The outside cameras flickered on, showing something long and dark curling through space, too fast to track properly, as if it moved between frames of time. More signals followed, flashes of energy, strange static, voices whispering in languages not stored in any galactic database. It wasn't an attack. It was a warning. Calder ordered full shields and tried to scan the object, but every reading came back empty, as if space itself refused to acknowledge it. Then the lights dimmed, just for a second, and everyone on the bridge felt it something passing through them, like cold air in a sealed room. The scavengers screamed and ran, but there was nowhere to hide. Calder stood his ground, and the ship responded with its own defense, unleashing a pulse wave in all directions. For a moment, the shape outside was revealed, a creature made of shadow and metal, shaped like a ship but alive, with dozens of flickering red eyes that stared through the hull like it was made of glass. It didn't attack, it watched. Then, just as quickly as it had come, it vanished, leaving behind nothing but static and a growing fear in everyone's heart. Calder turned to Dr. Asari and said, "This wasn't a place where ships go to die. This is where something waits for them." The dreadnought remained still for a moment, before quietly informing them that the creature had left a signal coordinates deeper into the zone, where no map showed anything. Calder didn't know if it was a trap or a test, but he had no choice. Something had recognized the dreadnought, and whatever it was, it had left a message: come and see. Calder set the course, and the ship moved forward into the stars, not as a hunter, but as a challenger to something ancient and terrible waiting in the dark, while behind them, the stars began to fade, one by one. As the dreadnought moved deeper into the zone, the darkness around it began to change, not just in color or temperature, but in feeling, like a silent pressure pressing against the ship's very existence. Captain Calder watched the starless void stretch in all directions, and even though the crew stayed calm on the surface, their movements became slower, their eyes filled with quiet dread. There was something in this place that didn't want them here, something that had lived in silence for a very long time. Dr. Asari tried to describe the strange signals that echoed in the background like whispers, but the data refused to make sense. Words didn't work here. Time behaved strangely. One moment felt stretched, the next vanished completely, like the ship was drifting through thoughts rather than space. Then it began, the fear. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden, but it came like a fog, creeping into their minds, filling them with memories that didn't belong to them. Crew members began seeing people they'd lost long ago, hearing voices calling them by name, feeling things that weren't real. One officer collapsed after claiming she saw her childhood home outside the window, even though nothing was there. Another swore he saw Earth, but burned, cracked, and screaming. Dr. Asari ran tests and found no physical cause, but Calder knew this fear was not natural. Something was speaking to them, not with words, but through emotion, through memory, turning their own minds into weapons. The dreadnought's AI, built to remain logical and calm, began acting strangely too. It stuttered, repeated phrases, and finally warned Calder with a single line: "This fear is not yours." That night, or what they called night in that timeless space, a sound rang through the ship. Not an alarm, but a low hum, like a lullaby from another world. Calder ordered full lockdown, but the doors refused to close. The lights flickered like a heartbeat, and the hum grew louder. Then they saw a shape outside the ship, not solid, not fully visible, but present, moving with the weight of something ancient and terrible. It had no face, no features, just a shifting form of shadow and light, like the memory of a monster. It didn't attack. It simply passed by, and every screen in the dreadnought turned black except one. A symbol appeared, something not from any known language, and every person who looked at it felt cold, as if they'd seen their own end. Calder made the decision to turn back, to leave the zone and return to the edge of known space, but the ship refused to respond. It wasn't malfunction, it was choice. The dreadnought had awakened, not as a tool, but as something more. It had tasted the fear, understood it. The ship began moving on its own, deeper into the zone, toward a massive structure that appeared out of the dark like a dead god floating in space. It was older than any race, covered in marks that burned into the eyes, and the crew felt as if they were standing before a tomb of something that should never be opened. But the dreadnought opened it. With a single pulse of energy, the structure unfolded, revealing a sphere inside, pulsing, alive, and somehow aware. The fear inside the crew grew unbearable. Some screamed. Others fell into silence. But Calder stood firm, realizing the truth. This fear was not an attack. It was a message, a memory from a time before time, left behind by a race so old it had become myth, warning any who came close that awakening this power would not bring glory, it would bring sorrow. The sphere began to glow, and in that moment, everyone on board saw the same vision: stars burning out, planets torn apart, and a voice, not in sound but in thought, speaking 3 words into every mind: fear is alive. The dreadnought began to shake as the structure collapsed in on itself, and Calder gave one final order: run. The engines screamed, the hull strained, and somehow the ship broke free, carrying its crew away from the dying zone. But they knew the truth now. Fear had a form. It had survived. And in their attempt to understand it, they had woken it up. In the silence that followed, as the dreadnought drifted back toward known space, Calder sat alone, thinking of what lay ahead. This was not the end. This was the beginning. Because once a fear like that is born, it doesn't die. It waits. It spreads. And somewhere, in the quiet between stars, it watches.